Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. This PowerPoint presentation and the accompanying narration was prepared for East Texas Baptist University for use in the course Criminal Justice 4302 Community Policing, and I'm Eric Hillman. The textbook that we use in this course is Community Policing 8th edition by Miller, Hess, and Orthman. This presentation is designed to supplement the student's reading of the text and not to replace it. Chapter 4 is entitled Problem Solving Proactive Policing. Chapter 4 has been divided into 4 segments to make it easier to upload and to make it easier for you to view. So this is Chapter 4D, the 4th and final segment of Chapter 4. Before you watch this video, you should have already watched and have taken notes on 4A, 4B, and 4C. In any subject that you study, ethics has to be a consideration, and perhaps even more so in police work because of the power that police officers have to forever change people's lives based on arrests. The question then comes up, is it okay to lie? And you see in the picture here it says prostitution sting nets 10 arrests. Well, if a prostitute or a woman says that she's an undercover police officer, she's not going to make too many arrests. And so in a sense, a female officer pretending to be a prostitute is lying or at least deceiving people. So then the question is it okay for police to lie? In almost every sting, whether it's prostitution or vice or drugs, the police officer is lying. He's lying and pretending to be a drug dealer. He's lying or pretending to be a drug buyer. She is lying, pretending to be a prostitute, or he is lying, pretending to be a John soliciting a prostitute's services. Well, the issue of whether police can lie has gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. And there's a couple of different decisions where the court has given some guidance. In Sorrells versus United States, the U.S. Supreme Court said, society is at war with the criminal classes, and the courts have uniformly held that in waging this warfare, the forces of prevention and detection, that's the police, may use traps, decoys, and deceptions. So here, the Supreme Court is saying it is okay for police to lie for the purpose of catching criminals. In another case from the U.S. Supreme Court, the court said there are circumstances when the use of deceit is the only practical law enforcement technique available. So the Supreme Court here is indicating that yes, for the end result of catching criminals, it is okay for police to lie. Are there limits on what police can do to catch criminals? Actually, yes, there is. This is an interesting case. And this deals with the subject of entrapment. Now, a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what entrapment is. I've heard people say, well, the officer was hiding behind a bush or hiding behind a tree when he was running radar, and so he stopped me, and that's entrapment because he was hiding, and that, of course, has nothing to do with entrapment. So let's define entrapment. Entrapment is where the government induces a person to commit a crime that he would not otherwise commit for the purpose of prosecuting the person. So if someone normally wouldn't commit a crime, but the government talks him into it, and then arrests him for the same crime that the government talks him into, that would be entrapment. Entrapment is illegal, and if the defendant can successfully argue entrapment, the defendant can have the case dismissed or have a directed verdict of not guilty. In Columbus, Ohio, the police used a very interesting tactic in a public park. The picture you see has two people in it, a man and a woman. Although you can't see the picture very clearly, The woman is topless, and that is a woman working for the police department. So, the police in Columbus, Ohio use this topless woman to lure men at the park. The woman walks into the park and starts talking to men, starts flirting with men, and then starts caressing them. She then says, "Oh, I'd love to see your penis." When they comply, unzip and show it to them, then she arrests them for indecent exposure. So why are they doing this in the first place? Well, in this park they had a problem with some perverts exposing themselves, and so in order to arrest people for indecent exposure, they decided to use this woman. Well, certainly the man should not have been exposing himself, but men have testosterone, so a man who would not be predisposed and normally would not expose himself, if he's approached by a topless woman who flirts with him and caresses him, and the testosterone is activated, he may then be tempted to expose himself in hopes of getting more sexual attention from this woman. The court, looking at the circumstances, said that was entrapment and illegal. Why? Because it could take people who normally would not commit a crime and basically convince them to commit a crime. That's what entrapment is. And in this case, that was illegal, and this man's case was overturned. When we talk about solving problems and the response, one of the available responses would be ADR, or Alternative Dispute Resolution. When the police are called to a house, to a store, to a scene of a dispute, oftentimes those disputes are not criminal in nature, but rather are civil. Landlords and tenants can have disputes over what's required or what's expected based on their rental agreement. Neighbors may have loud music problems. There could be traffic control issues because of a business in the area. There may be accidental damage to property by one person who the other person who caused the damage doesn't want to pay. So what do you do as a police officer if someone calls you and says, "My neighbor was mowing his lawn, the neighbor's lawnmower threw up a rock and cracked my window, my big picture window, and he won't pay for it"? Well, that is considered a civil dispute. Perhaps there are others in our society that are better equipped to solve that kind of dispute than the police are. So, alternative dispute resolution comes in many forms, but the two main forms are mediation and arbitration. So let's first look at mediation. Mediation generally is non-binding. In other words, both parties, both sides to the conflict, go to a neutral third party to solve the issue, and that neutral third party attempts to solve it, but the only way it can be solved if both sides agree, because it's not binding. No one's forced into following the recommendation of the mediator. Mediation tends to be informal. Neighbors go to usually a neutral mediation location, and people are casually dressed, including the mediator. The nice thing about mediation is that it's done by a neutral third party who does not favor one side of the dispute or the other. The third party normally has mediation training. In Texas, you can get a very basic level mediator training with 40 hours of training in mediation. Another advantage to mediation is that it allows people to take responsibility for solving their own dispute. People don't simply say, "You're the police, you solve it," or "You're the court, you solve it." by going to mediator, they're both involved and they're both expressing their concerns and they're both working towards a resolution that both will be satisfied with. And especially with neighbors, you don't want ongoing conflict. You hopefully want a resolution that both sides can live with so you can continue to live peaceably as neighbors. All parties must agree on the solution for it to be implemented. Why? Because it is non-binding. You're not bound to the mediator's decision. Litigation means going to court, and litigation is very expensive. Litigation can also cause confrontations. When we say violent, it could be physically violent, but could be very emotionally violent, could actually lead to physical violence between neighbors. And so in order to avoid the expense and the confrontation of litigation, many people decide to go to mediation to try to peaceably solve their differences. When you have a mediator, that mediator is trained, often with many years of experience also, and this mediator is especially good at trying to get people to find common ground. Can a police officer be mediator? Yes, but normally the police officer is not going to be a mediator for a couple of reasons. First of all, if these people can't solve their problems and they end up having some kind of confrontation, then the police officer needs to be a neutral, non-interested person to solve the issue if it later becomes criminal. And so generally it may be better to remove the police officer from the position of mediator in order to avoid that conflict of interest. Also, mediation tends to take a lot of time, and police officers have limited time. In an ideal world, police officers could be mediators in many disputes, and then if later the issue turned into a criminal matter, they could just send another police officer. But in the real world, we have limited resources, limited officers, limited funding, and so generally speaking, a police officer can't invest hours or days in a mediation process. That normally has to go to a trained mediator outside of the police department. The second time of alternative dispute resolution is called arbitration, which is binding. Just like in mediation, both sides tell their stories to the arbitrator, but in mediation, the mediator tries to find common ground. In arbitration, the mediator looks or hears both sides of the story and then decides who's going to win. Because of that, arbitration is considered more formal than mediation, although still less formal than litigation or going to court. So here we have an arbitration. Both sides are there, both sides represented by attorneys, and you have a panel of 3 arbitrators. When they hear both sides, those arbitrators will make a decision, and that decision is binding on both parties. So even if both parties are dissatisfied with the decision, they're still forced to live with it. An arbitrator usually has legal training. Arbitrators are often lawyers, whereas mediators in the less formal setting often have mediation training but are often not lawyers. So an arbitrator, because he or she has legal training, is able to try to solve these issues in a manner that is also consistent with the law in case this should ever spill over into the courts in the form of litigation. An arbitrator's decision, or in this case on the screen, an arbitration panel decision, is usually binding on both parties, even if they disagree with the result. When we talked about data analysis, we talked about different programs that could help analyze data to figure out what the real problems are and what's contributing to the problems, the underlying causes. One program used in problem analysis is CompStat. This is short for comparative statistics or computer statistics. CompStat is a crime management tool that was introduced by the New York Police Department in 1994. It has been used extensively and successfully by NYPD. All precincts, and there's many precincts in New York, produce weekly stats. Those stats are put in the computer, and then a crime analysis is done based on those stats. So CompStat is an advanced level crime analysis program created by NYPD. Using CompStat, the police brainstorm about problem solving and proactively respond. Now, this is a meeting of high-level officials within NYPD, and their job is to look at statistics using CompStat and to come up with ideas for solving crime problems. In these meetings, commanders, which are often captain level, in other words, a person who is in charge of a substation, they must explain to the group, which includes assistant chiefs, deputy chiefs, chiefs, commissioners, and others, what their plans are and what resources they use to solve problems. I attended the FBI Academy in 1999, and one of the things we did was take a trip to New York City, and we watched one of these CompStat meetings in progress, and it was pretty interesting. There is a lot of pressure on these commanders to solve crime, and they have to formulate ideas and plans, implement those ideas and plans using the data from CompStat, and then come back and report to the whole command staff and other commanders whether that plan worked. If it did, what worked correctly, and other commanders can have a takeaway of good ideas from this, and if it didn't work, why it didn't work, and what they plan on changing. And so each of these commanders can learn from each other, but these commanders are under a lot of pressure and can actually be relieved of their command if they're unable to solve problems effectively. Crime prevention is important in community policing. And the basic theory or philosophy behind crime prevention is that it's less expensive to prevent crime in the first place than to allow it to happen and then have to do an expensive investigation, an arrest, an expensive trial or prosecution, and then an expensive incarceration. Surely it must be cheaper, less expensive to the taxpayers, and less costly to society as a whole to prevent that crime from happening in the first place. And certainly, if we can prevent crime, we're going to have less human suffering too, because almost all forms of crime lead to human suffering, whether physical or emotional. One program within the realm of crime prevention is called CPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And the idea is that you want to change the environment to reduce crime. There are 3 principles to CPTED, which we'll list here. The first one is called natural access control. This is where you use doors, shrubs, fences, and gates to deny access. On some of the more expensive subdivisions, when they have gates and a guard shack, that would be considered natural access control. This is changing the environment to lessen or prevent crime. The second principle is natural surveillance. This is where you use windows and lighting to increase visibility. One of the best examples of this would be to look at these two convenience stores. On the store on the left, you see lots of posters advertising liquor, cigarettes, pretty much anything else that they sell. And what they found is that when the windows were full of all these advertising posters, it kept the police from looking in as they drove by and others from looking in. Certainly the police can't be everywhere at once, but there's a very high chance that when this store is being robbed, someone might be driving, walking, or bicycling by, and you can't see what's going on in that store. So if the clerk is being robbed, you can't see the robber, you can't see the clerk. The robber could shoot the clerk and leave him on the floor and walk away, and it might be 20 minutes before that murder is discovered if no one else goes in the store. And so by keeping the windows uncluttered, you have more of an appearance like the store on the right. Here you see the windows are clear. People driving by, including the police, can see the clerk. If the person at the counter was holding a gun, there's a good chance people outside could see the person with the gun, could see the clerk raising their hand, etc. And so you don't want your convenience stores, or any business for that matter, to have such a cluttered visual access that people can't see what's going on inside. A third principle is called territorial reinforcement. This is where you use sidewalks, landscaping, and porches to designate something as private property. If you've ever had the fortune or misfortune to live on a corner lot, you know that people will often, especially kids, they will often cut the corner by cutting through your yard. So one way to prevent that is to arrange your landscaping, your porches, your iron fence, etc., in such a way that it reinforces the fact that this is private property and they should not be trespassing. Territorial reinforcement. These are all ways of changing the environment in order to lessen or prevent crime. And so on the crime prevention triangle, you have victims, perpetrators, and location. Crime prevention through environmental design looks at the location and what can be changed about the location to lessen crime. Victimization, we talked about briefly. We need to discuss that a little bit more. Victimology is the study of victims. That would be a subset of criminology. We try to decide or figure out, using our crime statistics, where crime will happen in the future. One of the best predictors of future crimes is past crime, since victims tend to be repeat victims and locations tend to be repeat locations. The police need to use their crime statistics to pay special attention to areas and victims. If you can't identify patterns in suspects, or even if you can, you should also be looking at patterns among victims. Perhaps there may have been multiple incidents of a man harassing a woman or even sexually assaulting a woman. It may be that women leave, in this picture, leave the bar at the far end of this parking lot, and because there's no nearby parking, they're required to walk half a block or a block to their cars. It's likely in such a situation you may have repeat patterns among house burglaries are examples of repeat victimization. 1 in 3 house burglaries is repeat. Why is that? First of all, oftentimes people make temporary repairs. Instead of replacing the glass or fortifying the lock, they may just put a piece of wood, or as an officer, I've many times seen people just use cardboard to cover open broken windows, either because they don't have the time or the resources to fix that broken window. The unfortunate thing about cardboard is not only is it easy to get through, it's also quieter. If a person breaks glass, there's usually a shattering sound, but a person can remove cardboard with a simple box cutting tool almost silently. Secondly, the burglar knows what he left the last time, so maybe he tried to get in and out just to grab some jewelry. And he grabbed the jewelry and left, but on his way out he realizes, hey, there's a 70-inch big screen TV there. If only I had a truck or a bigger vehicle, I could grab that. So then he arranges to borrow a friend's truck or bring his own truck back in the future to pick up what he knows is in the house and that he left the last time. Thirdly, burglars know that most people have homeowners insurance, and so they just wait for the insurance company to replace what was stolen. So if he does steal the $2,000 big screen TV, he simply waits 6 to 8 weeks for the insurance company to pay out, and this crime victim will then buy a new big screen TV. By the way, if you ever get high dollar electronics, it's important that you not put the box for that big screen TV or the box for any other high dollar electronics at your front curb for the garbage man to take away. When you put your box for your 70-inch big screen by the trash can, you're just announcing to the whole world, I've got a brand new $2,000 TV in here. And so the burglar that burglarized you last time, who's often a person who lives in the neighborhood or a visitor of a person who lives in the neighborhood, sees that and then realizes, okay, insurance has replaced your TV, now it's time to go steal it again. The same is true, by the way, for your Christmas presents. When you get high dollar Christmas presents, don't leave the boxes out by the trash can at the curb to announce the existence and presence of high dollar items in your house. Otherwise, burglars may just wait for you to leave and then break in. Smart policing is a research partnership between police and criminal justice scholars. So this involves actual liaisons between the police and criminal justice professors. This concept of smart policing stresses in-depth problem analysis and, like other programs, emphasizes the use of crime data, crime analysis, performance measurement, and evaluation research. This particular program receives grants from the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. So the Department of Justice is the federal government department that's over the FBI, among other agencies. Within the Department of Justice, the BJA, Bureau of Justice Assistance, is able to give grants for many different things, and one of them is this smart policing research partnership, where universities and police departments can work together to try to analyze problems and solve them. And that's the end of Chapter 4D, and actually the end of the entire Chapter 4. Once you finish watching and taking notes on this segment, then you should review all of your notes from Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 in preparation for the next exam. Thank you and have a great day.